American side, on the Western side, and not on the conflict areas, because I think Abby and Nancy has very well articulated what's happening on the other end. One is we have inconsistency. I was once in Sudan talking to the government agencies over there about women, inclusion of women in the negotiation, in the peace negotiating process. And they looked at me and they said, please stop. When the American team and the European team include 50% of women in their team to us, then you can talk to us. And you know what? I was silent. I was silenced, actually, with their response. It's a true response. It is a response, you see it over and over and over again. We do not have full inclusion of women in this end. In our team, in our peace negotiation teams, in our diplomacy teams, in all our sectors. So that's one issue. Second is, sometimes we come across as even more conservative and culturally reserved than the cultures we are working in ourselves. So I'll give you an example of Iraq. When the invasion of Iraq took place, usually as nonprofits organization, we go to the UN in war zones. You know, we go to the UN. The UN, at the minimum, helps us, regulate us, you know, informs us, this is what you need to do, this is the areas that are dangerous. They really inform us with a lot of information. This time we went to the UN said, no one is talking with us. And so we go to the US calls a meeting with the NGOs, Iraqis, internationals, and UN, all at the same time. And one of the first declarations they say in terms of humanitarian aid in Iraq, they said, we have changed the food ration distribution from the stores, where previously everyone had an ID card and you go to a store and you get your food basket, to the mosque. Now, a lot of us Iraqis were like, the mosque? What? I mean, yes, we are all mostly Muslims, not all, but we're Muslims, but the mosque plays it's not a public space in our culture, it's a private space in our culture. It's actually more private space than sometimes the churches are in here, you know, it's particularly in Iraqi culture. And so we're all like looking at each other, it's like, what are you doing? What? You're shifting the politics of the mosque by this action. Because then I go outside and I meet the women we are working with, and they're telling me during Saddam Hussein's regime, an oppressive regime, when they said when we would go to the store, we would get our food ration as any equal citizen. Because it's the store, I don't have to abide by the mosque rules. And they said it's ironic that under American administration, we have to cover and go to the mosque and fight in the backline rooms, because the mosque women are not equal in their space. You know, it's the men in the front and the women in the back. And we have to fight for the same exact food that we used to get as citizens. So sometimes we are more culturally, and the stories actually of that goes on and on. Only recently I was in Iraq, and some American officials, so they're like, you can't do women's rights in Iraq because it's culturally not acceptable. And I am an Iraqi. But more than that, I've lived here 20 years in Iraq, but my staff have been operating in Iraq, working on women's rights in the last 7 years, with their headscarves and with their abaya and all of that, and everyone's like, huh? What are you doing? So how can we not become more conservatives than the cultures that we are working in? And I just gave you an example of Iraq, but the truth, I have seen it in Kosovo, and I have seen it in Sudan, and I have seen it in Nigeria, and I've seen it consistently in almost every environment I work in. The last but not least is we have to move from talking the talk to walking the walk. Every time I read any government official paper on any issue lately, women are included, indeed. It's, again, you know, it's like, oh, I don't need to speak or lobby or advocate because the language is excellent. There are women included in peace and security, in farming and food initiative and food security. So we have learned to talk the talk. It's actually almost fantastic, I have to say. But there is no mechanism and no accountability whatsoever in measuring that talk. And I don't want to talk another 20 years of my life about the importance of women's rights. This is the time to act. So this year marks $1 trillion spending on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. $1 trillion spending. So you can look at it this way. And then when we talk about reporting about what is the spending vis-a-vis Iraqi women and Afghan women, $500 million. So you say, wow, if you look at $500 million as a stand on its own, it's fantastic. But when you compare it to the $1 trillion, it becomes irrelevant. It shows you how the small proportion of it. $150 billion was passed for the war in terms of budget for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan this year, 150 compared to $150 million for development and humanitarian aid. So when you look at them only in numbers, without comparing what's actually the larger spending is, you get impressed. This is so fantastic. We're actually spending on women. But then when you look at it, what it means vis-a-vis the larger discussion in terms of spending and resourcing on these countries or in that war, it shows how irrelevant it is. So one is we need measurement. You know, we need to hold our own governments accountable for not only the measurement, but for the actions. Are we educating our officials in overseas about women's rights, to know, or about the full inclusion of women, to know that it's not a symbolic issue that is important, that it's actually impossible to get peace if we're not including women? We're not. Are we making sure that when we are negotiating with the other parties, i.e. the Taliban in Afghanistan, are we holding ourselves accountable to ensure that Afghan women are in the negotiating discussions? We are not so far. Are we having a measurement of each employee in U.S. government in terms of being allocated in different countries? Where are your agenda on women, and where is your policy on women, and where are your accountability and resources on women? And there are actually good lessons out there, you know, lessons from countries as simple as Rwanda, where, this is talking about gender issues in Rwanda. There is a gender monitoring committee that reports directly to the president of Rwanda. It has its own budget. It goes to each ministry, including the defense ministry. It goes to each mayor, each governor, each municipality official, and they look at, have you allocated funding for women? Have you included women in your team? Have you measured yourself vis-a-vis women? And then they report it directly to the president. So are there ways in which actually we can hold ourselves accountable and move from walking the walk to talking the talk? There are absolutely good ways and good models. But we can't just stay in this discussion right now. It's no longer about policies only. It is also about implementation. And last but not least, and I'll stop here, we need a public awareness campaign about the importance of these issues. We have fantastic resolutions and policies, CEDA, 1325, etc. But you know what? I don't think many in the population know what this means. And 1320, I mean, I work on 1325, but it has the most horrible name. You know, no one knows what 1325 is. So we really, you know, learning from other campaigns and other movements, we need to popularize these issues. We need to make it the issue not between activists and policymakers. We need to make it every single woman and every single man's issue, as opposed to confining it to only those who have dedicated our lives to this discussion. When a policymaker becomes accountable for their citizens, and not only the lobbyists or the activists, the discussion becomes different, and it's time to create a really public campaign where every single one is holding everyone accountable, government and non-government officials accountable for their own measurements and spending on women.
Zainab, thank you so much for... So, we've had three really sensational presenters, and before we have Ellen respond to what she's heard, I just want to get a quick answer from each participant. The current United States government, are you hopeful that anything will happen here, or are you pessimistic at this point, a year and a half in? Abby?
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
We have a great Secretary of State who really means what she means, and she is walking the walk. And I've seen the effects of her advocacy in the Peace Durga in Afghanistan. We all saw that there were 350 women there. However, they were 350 women out of over 3,000. You know, women hold up. Apparently, they hold up 0.05% of the sky. You know, you know, we have a long way to go. There hasn't been enough money. There hasn't been enough real life activism, and we need much more. And frankly, I think she's having a hard job advocating for this inside of her own administration, upward into the White House, and she needs our support to do that.
Nancy?
I'll have to echo the yes and no. And it's true. I mean, especially with the special envoy, every time he comes to Haiti, he makes sure that we convene a meeting with both rural and urban women, with the Ministry of Women's Affairs, which started around Beijing. And we try very hard to influence the policies. After the earthquake, the national policy, again, how Zena presented it, tried from the women's platform to have measurable outcome, incremental, measurable outcome with specific benchmarks for increasing the percentage of women's participation and presence from conception to implementation. The challenges, however, remain that the international community as a whole, now with the Reconstruction Commission, is not necessarily speaking with one voice and one accord. And the money allocated, as I said again, for transversal issues needs to be specifically earmarked not only for actions, but also for preventable reverberating effects of this long-term complex humanitarian emergency that Haiti still is.
Zainab?
I will just add really quickly, I would first echo what particularly Abby said. And I would encourage us, just because we can't calm down. This is the time for us to push. So we do have Hillary Clinton, and we have Susan Rice, and we have few fantastic women in the administration. That doesn't mean we should just sit down and watch them fight the fight. The more we push, the better we are helping them in the discussion.
Ellen, we'll start with you. Do you feel that the women in this administration are hamstrung? As I give.
This has been such a rich conversation on such a diverse set of issues, but I want to bring it back to the common themes, which are gender accountability, measurement, enforcement. I want to bring it back to the common themes: gender accountability, measurement, enforcement. There is a little bit of progress here. I mean, Hillary Clinton has every political officer from every country reporting now on aspects of life in their countries that deal with gender accountability. There is a disaggregation of information that's going on that will, over the course of time, change the culture of the State Department, change the nature of our diplomacy, and change the allocation of resources. But it's a very incremental process. It's hugely important, though, that all of those political officers are now Zainab raised this issue, being trained to think about what's the status of women in your country. That just didn't happen before. And this consciousness is being introduced in a slow way. But it's a very incremental process. You heard from Nancy how tough this has been with former President Clinton trying to constantly move the conversation to gender accountability in Haiti, but having a tough time doing so. So education of diplomats, benchmarking of women, benchmarking of performance, saying to people, you won't keep your job if half the resources don't go to women, changing the nature of our healthcare internationally, the global health legislation that is being passed, or the global health initiative that's underway at the State Department, is benchmarking gender in a different way. Similarly, there is a reorganization of U.S. aid going on that will have more accountability. But I want to say, because I want to make this an action agenda very quickly, that the organization that has, in fact, attempted to disaggregate gender and benchmark gender better than any in the world is the one we're here today to celebrate, the United Nations. We're at a UNIFEM conference, starting with Eleanor Roosevelt. The very foundations of the United Nations talked about equal rights and human rights for men and women. It wasn't just about men, because not just Eleanor Roosevelt, but the 18 women and a sea of men at the founding of the UN, many of them from countries that were newly independent states, places like India, knew that if we talked only about men, it would be only about men, and they forced us to talk about women.